welcome to everyone once again to our weekly go-to meeting, fellowship opportunity on the Sabbath to hear a message from one of God's ministers. Tonight, we will be hearing a message from a minister of God, Michael Heiss, and he will be bringing to us part two of the message that he gave previously, the role of women, part two. So I present to you, Michael Heiss.
Well, good evening, everyone. Always a pleasure to be with you. We are going to continue with the role of women. This is going to be part two, and we're going to do it in three parts. The first part will consist of two women in the Old Testament, one of which we've already covered, but I want to give you one or two more pointers on her. Then we'll go into the women of the New Testament, showing highlights how God honored women, what the Father did in particular for one woman, an amazing event story. Sometimes we read right over them, but I do want to take time for the third, which is going over some difficult scriptures that seem to indicate that Paul didn't like women or put them down, how women need to be subject to their husbands, how they cannot speak in church, that they're to be silent. And we'll find out that it's not necessarily what we think once we know the historical background. And it took a long, long time for me to understand it, but I think I do now. So we'll all find this very interesting. So in terms of the women in the Old Testament, this is a review of Deborah. And I do want to point out that she had 6 designations, actually 7, and no other woman in the Old Testament had those designations. 1, she was a prophetess. 2, she was a judge. 3, she was a national leader. Remember, she's the one who summoned Barak. 4, she was a military commander, sent the armies into battle. 5, she was a songwriter. 6, she was a singer of songs, a minstrel. We found that out. And a 7th one, she was a mother in Israel. So technically, she had 7. Now, in terms of men, I could find only 2 other people, 2 men who had the same 6 designations. That's all I could find. So if any of you can find out another one, please let me know. I'd really like to know. 1, Moses, and then David. But other than those 2, nobody else had the same 6 designations. So Deborah was in rare company. So now, though, I do want to show you one of the things she did that amazes me, truly is, and I didn't really cover this last time. So if you'll turn to the book of Judges, Judges chapter 4, this is the story of Deborah, Judges chapter 4, and we will find in verse 12, they told Sisera that Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor, and Sisera gathered all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people with him. So they were all up there, and so was Barak and his 10,000 men. But between verse 13 and verse 14, an event happened that the Bible doesn't tell us about, but Josephus does. And let me read to you what Josephus has to say about that. When Barak and the Israelites saw the chariots of iron and the Canaanites, whereupon the Israelites and Barak himself were so affrighted at the multitude of these enemies that they were resolved to march off. They were going to cut tail and run, had not Deborah restrained them and commanded them to fight the enemy that very day, for that they should conquer them, and God would be their assistance. So here you've got an army of 10,000 men. They're terrified at the sight of the Canaanites and the iron chariots. They're ready to just run away. And here was one solitary woman, Deborah, standing in their path, a commanding figure that just by the force of her personality and perseverance shamed them. She rallied them. And that's when we see in verse 14. And Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand." See, this verse 14 corresponds to what Josephus says. So it's in between verses 13 and 14. that the almost surrender of the Israelites' armies took place had it not been for Deborah. And I think she really lived up to her name. Remember, it says she was the wife of Lapidot. Well, that may be true, but also the term wife comes from the Hebrew ishet, wife of. It could also be woman of. It's the same word, just a matter of what context you have. And Lapidot is the plural of the Hebrew lapid. And lapid means fire or flame. The plural, fiery flames or flaming fire. So here was Deborah, a woman of fiery flames, and she lived up to that name as she held the Israelites in check and sent them into battle. Truly a most remarkable woman. So I wanted to point that out. We should all learn to respect what Deborah did. Now for the second woman. This woman was not a priestess of any kind. She was not a general, not a prophet, not a judge, didn't hold any rank of any kind. In fact, in terms of male chauvinism, she was a housewife. But yet, this housewife, this plain Israelite woman, uttered a prayer to God, so heartfelt, so moving, that God did not refuse her. And as a result, the history of Israel was altered. It's an amazing story. 1 Samuel, just a few pages over. We're already in Judges, so all we have to do is move over to 1 Samuel. And we're talking about Hannah. Hannah, unfortunately, had a very, very bad family life. Her husband loved her, but she was a second wife. Well, actually, in the husband's eyes, she was wife number one. But unfortunately, it says the Lord shut up her womb. She had no children. The other wife did have children, both boys and girls, and never let Hannah forget it. And Hannah was just depressed about it. So, and every year they would go up to the Feast of Tabernacles at Shiloh. So anyway, at the time, verse 4 of 1 Samuel 1, and the time came that Elkanah offered, he gave portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he gave a double portion, for he loved Hannah. However, the Lord had shut up her womb. And Hannah was so distraught, this whole thing. Verse 9, she rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. And she was in verse 10, she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept sorely. And this is where she propositions God. She, in effect, offers a quid pro quo. She really does. And God takes her up on it. Verse 11, and she vowed a vow. That's serious. You don't take that lightly. And said, O Lord of hosts. She didn't say, oh God. She didn't say, she said, Lord of hosts. This is a term that envisions the commanding armies. This was the great king of all the armies of heaven. She's showing in her humble state that she's addressing the great God who commands the armies of heaven. If you will indeed look upon the affliction of your handmaid and remember me and forget not your handmaid, but will give to your handmaid a man-child or a son. So God, if you will do this, that's part of the bargain, then I in turn will do this. Then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. And dropping down to verse 19, afterwards they rose up in the morning, the whole family worshiped before the Lord, and returned and came to their house to Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Oh no, God is keeping his end of the bargain. He's accepting Hannah's offer. And it came to pass, when the time had come, Hannah conceived, bore a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. Now just think about this. If Hannah had not offered up her prayer, and if God had not taken her up on the offer, we would have no Samuel. We would not be reading a book or two books in the Bible, 1st or 2nd Samuel. There would have been no Samuel. There would have been no understudy to Eli. Samuel, the one who talked with God. God talked to him, beginning with a young boy. God had him anoint Saul. Later on, he anointed David, from whom came the Christ. History would have been different. Now, God can take care of anything. He can prepare and is capable of working through any contingencies. We all know that. But the history would have been different. Remember James 5, verse 16? The effectual fervent prayer or supplication of a man, a person, is great avail? Yes. God heard Hannah, and He'll hear us too. Now, chapter 2, we're not going to read all of chapter 2. We're just going to read the first 2 verses. But I would urge you to read these 10 verses. This is her exaltation. And Hannah prayed and said, my heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. This in Hebrew is what we call this in Hebrew parallelism. It's one after another. It's parallel, parallel, parallel. And it's really forceful in the Hebrew. You can even get it in the English. My heart rejoices. My horn is exalted. My mouth is enlarged. It is magnificent Hebrew prose. In verse 2, there is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside you, neither is there any rock like our God. What a magnificent exaltation. And then I would urge you to read the exaltations in Luke, the 1st chapter, of Mary and Elizabeth, along with Hannah. And you will not find any greater exaltation by any man that was greater than these 3. True, magnificent exaltation. All right? That we could have more to say about Anna, but we need to move on. We're now going to move into the New Testament. And so if you'll turn with me to Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and we're going to go to the 2nd chapter of Luke, and we're going to meet up with a woman named Anna. She's a prophetess, and she comes in the temple where Jesus was just brought in verse 36. Now there was Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was of great age, having lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity. She was a widow of about 84 years. She was a spry 85 years old, I'll say that. Did not depart from the temple, serving day and night with fastings and supplications. But look at this in verse 38. And at the same time she came up, giving praise to the Lord, and she spoke concerning him to all those in Jerusalem who were waiting for redemption. He was preaching it away. Here was the first evangelical individual, the first one to preach the Messiah, the Christ. And it was a woman, Anna, a prophetess. Not a man, but Anna. God didn't care for women. God just looked down on them. No, God honored. He gave first crack to Anna. And not only that, who was the first person to see Christ, the risen Christ, after he rose from the grave? Another woman. In fact, we'll see now how Jesus bypassed Peter and John and gave that honor to Mary Magdalene. The book of John. John, the Gospel of John, chapter 20. And we'll pick it up right at the beginning, and we'll breeze right on through here. On the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb. She saw the tomb was empty, the rock was rolled back. So she runs to tell Simon Peter and the other disciple, which we know is John, and they come running to see the tomb. Peter came following. He went into the tomb, verse 6. The napkin that had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloth. Then the other disciple went in, verse 9. For they did not yet understand the scripture which decreed that he must rise from the dead. Just think, 3.5 years they spent with Christ, yet they still didn't understand that he was going to rise from the dead. So, that makes me think to myself, I don't have to feel so bad if I don't understand or get certain things. If the disciples, after 3.5 years, didn't get that, there's hope for me yet. So anyway, they leave. They went away, verse 10. But Mary stood outside the tomb weeping. And as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb. She saw 2 angels. Well, 5 minutes ago, those angels weren't there. Or at least they didn't manifest themselves, but they did for Mary. And they said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? And she said, Because they've taken away my Lord. I don't know where they've laid him. So she turned around and she saw another figure. She didn't realize it was Jesus. So Jesus said, Woman, why are you weeping? She said, Sir, if you have carried him off, tell me where you've laid him. And Jesus said to her, Mary. She knew that name. She knew the tone of voice, and she knew it was Jesus. But now think, Jesus was there all along. And he saw Peter. He saw John. He could have said, hey guys, over here. I'm here. Come on. He didn't. He gave that honor to Mary. It's amazing. He honored her. So next on our list is another woman. A plain woman, but a woman Jesus loved. In fact, he loved the whole family. But first, go right across the column to verse 29. Jesus said to him, verse 30. Now then, Jesus did many other miracles in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. This is John writing. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Now, how many individuals understood that he was the Christ, the Son of God, before the resurrection? Well, let's take a look at one of them. The Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 13. Now, after coming into the parts of Caesarea Philippi, which was north, way north, Jesus questioned his disciples, saying, Whom do men declare me, the Son of Man, to be? They said, Well, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, Jeremiah. He said to them, But you, whom do you declare me to be? Simon Peter answered and said, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said to him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Well, I think we'll see the Father revealed it to somebody else as well, namely a woman named Martha. So turn to John chapter 11, if you would. The Gospel of John, chapter 11. This is a story here where Lazarus dies and Jesus resurrects him. But look in verse 5. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. There was a remarkable relationship between Jesus and his family. Anyway, Jesus has come. Martha heard it. She came and said to Jesus, verse 21, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother shall live again. Martha said, I know that he will rise again at the resurrection. Jesus said to her, he gave one of his famous I am answers. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, shall live again. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall not die forever. Do you believe this, Martha? Do you believe it? And what did she say to him? Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who is to come into the world. How did Martha know that? Flesh and blood didn't do it. Humans didn't know. Even the disciples, remember when they were in the boat and they were being racked by a storm and Jesus had to say, peace, be still. And then the disciples said one to another, who is this that the sea and the wind obey him? They didn't know. And Jesus didn't tell her. That left only one source, the Father. So here we have the Father revealing it to Martha. Martha was kind of special. She had great favor with Jesus and the Father. Okay, now we're going to quickly look at Romans chapter 16, and we're going to mention these basically in passing because we don't have a lot of time. So look at Romans chapter 16. Romans chapter 16 and verse 1. Now I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church, charging you to receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of saints, and to assist her in whatever she may need from you, because she also has been of great assistance to many, including myself. We don't know what she did, but Paul said, oh, she was of great help to me. She was helping him. She wasn't just barefoot and pregnant or keep her at home. There were women who actually served and were admired and respected by God. Then verse 3, there's Priscilla and Aquila. Now we find them elsewhere as well. In this case, Priscilla gets top billing. In some cases, Aquila gets top billing, but they were husband and wife. And they had a church in their home. And look what he says. Who have laid, verse 4, who have laid down their own necks for my life. What did they do for Paul? How did they put their lives on the line? We don't know, but they did. So these were very important in the work of Paul. And he says, salute the church at their house. So they hosted a church home. That is, they hosted a church. So when people came to services, they didn't have big buildings. So they met in members' homes, and Aquila and Priscilla had such one. Verse 6, salute Mary, who labored much for us. There was Mary who was serving. Again, Paul just mentioned this in passing, but I think we read over this too much. I don't believe that we give these people enough credit and realize that they really served. And now here is where are we here? I'm looking for her. Salute Mary. Oh, yes. Verse 7. Salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and fellow prisoners, who are of note among the apostles. So here was Junia and her husband. They were in prison with Paul. Boy, they had to be working very closely with Paul and doing who knows what to get put in jail along with Paul. And they were of note of the apostles. The apostles knew them. They knew Junia. A remarkable thing. And one last reference here in Philippians chapter 4. You get it here? Philippians chapter 4 and verses 2 and 3. I exhort Euodia and Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And I ask you, my true yoke fellow, to assist these women who labored with me in the gospel. They labored with Paul in the gospel. All these women worked with Paul, and Paul is praising them. So, considering that, how do we explain the scriptures that seem to say, women, no, submit yourselves to your husband. I don't permit you to speak and talk in services. Well, we have the 14 rules of Bible study, and there are two of them in particular that we should note. One, let the Bible interpret the Bible, And the second one, know the historical background. And unless we know the historical background, we read right over this. So let's take a look at a few of these scriptures. Okay. First, we're going to go to 1 Peter. Let's take a look at 1 Peter. 1 Peter 3, and 2 Peter. You got to go to 1 Peter. Going backwards here. 1 Peter 3, verse 1. Likewise, you wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that even if they are not obedient to the word, through the behavior of the wives, they may be gained without a word, having witnessed your chaste behavior carried out with reverence. While adorning, let it not be additional external adornment of braiding of hair or wearing gold jewelry or dressing in costly clothing. In other words, don't look like a Hollywood starlet, please. But let your adornment be the inward person of the heart, manifested in the uncorruptible jewel of the meek and quiet. Dropping down to verse 5. For in this way also the holy women of the past, who hoped in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you are doing what is right. Now, two things to notice here. He's talking about Sarah, calling him Lord. Well, it so happens today, every Israelite wife in the nation of Israel today calls her husband Lord. Why? The word in Hebrew for husband is Baal or Baal. So when an Israeli woman introduces her husband, she says, "This is my Baal." So she calls him Lord. Not that she thinks he's God, but she calls him Lord. Now, Sarah indeed was meek and submissive. And just think what she did. She followed Abraham, or Abraham was first, from Ur the Chaldees, pulling up stakes, everything, lock, stock, and barrel, moving to Haran. And after she's there a while, got to do it again. The call from Genesis 12:1, when God called Abraham out again. Got to pack up everything and move again, going down to the land of Canaan, famine in the land. Of course, she's living in a tent. She went from a house to a tent. I'm sure it was a pretty good tent because, after all, Abraham was a rich man. But nevertheless, a tent is not a house. Well, down to Egypt they have to go. And Abraham says, no, look, sir, you're a beautiful woman. So please, why don't you say that you're my sister? I'm your brother. Because if they think I'm your husband, they're liable to kill me and take you. So let's do this. Sarah goes along with it. She is submissive to Abraham. And of course, she's in the harem, but God gets them out of it. And she's meek and submissive all the time until she isn't. Yes. Remember Hagar and Ishmael? Oh, did she erupt. Remember, get that woman out of here. I won't have that woman with my son. Ishmael was to be separated. Abraham was taken aback. He didn't know what to do. He didn't like it. Finally, it took God to intervene and say, Abraham, listen to Sarah. Obey your wife. He did. So, you see, we have to remember this. Sarah was fulfilling the original role for which God created a wife. Remember an Ezer Kenegdo, a militant fighter, one who stands side by side, but who also shows where he's wrong if she thinks he's wrong. She is not to be a shrinking violet and just blindly do everything. And here is Peter praising her. Well, rightly so. Now look, if I can find it quickly enough here, 1 Peter 5, I think, and yes, here we go. Look at this, 1 Peter 5 and verse 5. And Peter says, in the same manner, you younger men be subject to the older men. Well, that's just like a wife being subject to a husband. What's he saying here? And all of you be subject one to another, being clothed with humility. So Paul's saying, look, you younger men, respect your elders. They've been around the block a time or two. They've got something to teach you, to point out to you. But he's telling the older men, hey, listen to the younger men. And that's how one submits to the other. Husband is to submit to his wife as much as the wife is to submit to the husband. And the husband does that by listening to his wife. Now, let's turn to Ephesians. And we'll see what Paul says there. But we have to, again, let the Bible interpret the Bible. Ephesians chapter 5. Now we'll break right into verse 22. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he's the Savior of the body. For even as the church is subject to Christ, in the same way also let wives be subject to their own husbands in everything. But then he says, husbands, love your wives in the same way that Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Well, you don't love your wife by shutting her up. And look in verse 20. Here's the key. Verse 21. Submit yourselves to one another in the fear of the Lord. He's saying, for example, you wives submit to your husbands. But the husband, on the other hand, is to submit to the wife as well, listening to her. And you have to interpret the wives submit yourselves to the husband in light of what he said in the verse just before it. We're to submit to one another in humility, with love and compassion. So you can't take this a group of scriptures here and say, well, Paul's putting down women. No, he's not. And when to be subject to your own husbands in everything, the husband's unconverted, says, wife, you're not going to keep that Sabbath anymore. You're not going to go keep those holy days anymore. On and on. Should the wife dutifully follow? I don't think so. Look at Sarah. She wasn't going to put up with Hagar and Ishmael. So we have to take things in context and get the balance. And now we need to look at the scriptures that have bothered me for 30 to 40 years until I finally understand it. But we have to get the historical background in order to do that. And that is especially 1 Corinthians. In particular, 1 Corinthians 14. Right. But the book of Corinthians is written in a way and has topics in it that no other epistle of Paul really does. He talks about meat in the shambles, talks about meat sacrificed to idols. He talks about women with short hair. He talks about women not being allowed to speak. What is this? Why is this? Now, I knew for years it had to be something, it had to do with something in Corinth. I didn't know what, but I knew it had to be. Finally, I ran across the volumes that gave me the answer. For example, in Corinth, right in Corinth, was a magnificent edifice temple to Aphrodite. And there were about 1,000 priestesses serving. That's a lot of priestesses. That's what shall I say, a nice word for temple prostitute, because that's what they really were. And those temple prostitutes had shaved hair, almost bald heads. You know, maybe I could fit in with that. Okay, wrong gender. But the point is, that's why Paul speaks the way he does about women have a covering. He did not want that influence of the priestesses of Aphrodite to prevail in the church. He didn't want people who might come into the church to see these women with their hair shaved or shorn. They might think that they're somehow connected with the priestesses. Paul would have none of that. Well, that's not our topic tonight, but that's why Paul wrote about it, because of that condition. Now, Corinth was a port city. And just across the bay from Corinth was the Oracle of Delphi. That was most interesting. Now, one thing, whenever you went to the Delphi Oracle, you, of course, offered an animal, whatever it happened to be, a cow, sheep, goats, pigs, whatever. And you would offer it to the god, and then, of course, the rest of it, they would ship across the bay to Corinth, and it would be sold there in the markets. Now you know why Paul had to address meat sold in the marketplace, offered to idols, because you didn't have that in the other churches. There was only one Oracle of Delphi. Now the Oracle of Delphi kind of operated like this. You came in, you asked your questions, but you had to write the questions out on leaden tablets. And you were ushered into a little shrine. You might call it the holy place of the oracle. And there was a woman there. There were up to 3 priestesses. No priests, just women. These women were older. They were in their 50s. And they would sit down on a tripod over a chasm, a hole in the rock. And out of there came fumes. And you, of course, would write out your questions in writing on the clay tablets. Then the woman would ask the question, and she would erupt in unutterable nonsense, gibberish. You didn't know what she was saying. Nobody knew what she was saying, but there was an interpreter called a poet who would write out the answers. And I did have a summary. I finally found one volume that could give me a summary. And so if I can find it quickly enough, I would like to read you part of what we have here. If I can find it here, well, I can't find it quickly enough, and the lighting is a little dark here. But at any rate, it was confusion. And it said that the inquirer came out of it more confused and mystified than when he went in. So that tells you Paul's main thrust in 1 Corinthians 14, which is verse 33. Verse 33, for God is not the author of confusion. The Oracle of Delphi was the author of confusion. Nobody knew what was being said. And that was Paul's whole thrust here. He didn't want people speaking in utterances that could not be understood. So when Paul says, for example, in verse 34, let your women be silent in the churches, for they are not allowed to speak, but they are to be in subjection. All right? What is not clear for here is that there are 2 Greek words for speak. One word indicates well thought out language, solidly composed in the mind. The other word is more utterances. It can be haranguing, it can be gibberish, gobbledygook. That is the word that Paul uses here. So when Paul says, let your women be silent, he's not saying, you women can't speak a word, period. No, he's saying, don't speak in gibberish. No gobbledygook, because of the word he's using. Now he says the same thing of the men. Look above here in verse 27. If anyone speaks in a foreign language, let it be by 2 or 3 at the most. And let that be in succession, and let one interpret. But if there is no interpreter, let him be silent in the church. So he's telling the men to be silent just as much as he's telling the women to be silent. He wants things in order. Now, when he said also, when it says women, now this is a generic term for women. But I've always wondered about this because in verse 35, he says, if they wish to learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for a woman to speak in church. again, speak in gibberish, or to show up her husband. Now, specifically, when it says women, it's more specifically referring to wives. In fact, the Greek scholars will show it depends on context. And perhaps there should have been a note in the margin here, women or wives. He's talking to wives. He's not talking to widows. Widow doesn't have a husband at home, obviously. Single women don't have a husband at home, that is, those who have never been married. He's talking to wives. Why is he talking to wives that way? Well, in the Greek and Roman world, the man, the husband, had rule over the wife. She couldn't do anything without his permission. He had, frankly, he could have the reign of life and death over her. If you were listening to a speaker in any of the outdoor theaters, no woman could interrupt or ask a question. A man could, but no woman could. But now in the church, Paul explains, now in the church, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. There's neither male nor female, because all are equal in Christ. That's right. But Paul doesn't want these women to think, ooh, now that I'm equal, I can say and do anything I want. Paul says, no, there's an order. The Father, and underneath him Christ. Now, the Christ isn't inferior to the Father. After all, he created the whole universe, the one who became the Word. There was the Word. No. He isn't inferior. But in terms of ranking, in terms of function, yes, he functions differently. There's a man and a woman. They're equal. But in terms of function, they function differently. So Paul is saying he doesn't want the woman to show up the husband. You remember, in these churches back then, they didn't have it the way we do today. Today in the service, we have an opening prayer, we have a couple of songs, or some have the songs first and then the opening prayer. Then we have maybe announcements, we have a sermonette, then we have a main message, a sermon, either given by a minister who's there, or maybe, if you can, live streaming by Fred. It doesn't matter. That didn't exist back then. They didn't have elders who were in authority. This was early on. Later, when Paul and the apostles realized, this thing isn't going to end anytime soon. Jesus is not coming back as soon as we thought. Then Paul writes in his pastoral epistles, Timothy and Titus, and what does he say in them? Ordain elders. Then they began to have elders in the church, but not at the time Corinthians was written. You would have people getting around, sitting, and then somebody would stand up and start to speak. And maybe he was prophesying. Maybe it was a language that not easy to understand. And here's the man and the woman, they're the husband and wife, they're listening. They don't fully understand it. What Paul is saying is, why don't you go up and ask a question? Let your husband do that, or he is better equipped to understand it, so ask him at home. It wasn't that Paul was saying, don't you say a word to anybody, or don't you greet anybody in the church. No, he wasn't saying that. He was saying, number one, don't speak gibberish, and he was saying, number two, ask respectfully. Paul was very conscious of the order there. And we find the same thing, for example, in 1 Timothy. So let's take a look at 1 Timothy, and we'll see something similar there. Here, we get to 1 Timothy 2, verse 8. Therefore, I desire that men everywhere pray, lifting up holy hands without anger and evil opinion. In like manner, also let the women adorn themselves with clothing that shows modesty, discretion, not with elaborate braidings of the hair, or with gold or pearls, or expensive apparel. Once again, don't be like the Hollywood starlets and dress yourself up in gaudy fashion, but with that which is fitting for women who profess to have reverence for God. Let a woman learn in quietness and submissive in every respect. For I do not permit a woman to teach nor exercise authority over man. Now, this is referring more specifically to husband and wife. When Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach, well, now, wait a minute. You can find in Acts where Priscilla and Aquila both helped to teach Apollos. Here was Priscilla, a woman, teaching a man who was learned in the scriptures. So obviously, Paul's not saying a woman cannot teach a man, but he specifically doesn't want the woman to continually teach her husband. And that's what it seems the Greek is indicating. Continuous, ongoing. I do not permit a woman to teach her husband or exercise authority over her husband. That's the thrust of what Paul is saying. He's not saying that a woman can never teach or that a woman can never speak in services at all. So when we understand that, we're better able to understand what Paul is saying. He honored women. He praised women. The same thing, by the way, is in Titus. If we can find Titus here quickly enough, teaching here. Yes, Titus chapter 2 in verse 3. In like manner, teach the older women to be in their behavior as is fitting for godly women, not slanderers, not enslaved to much wine, but teachers of that which is right. So they are to be teachers, that they may teach the young women to love their husbands and to love their children, to be modest, chaste, keepers of the home, true, to be good and submit themselves to their own husbands, so that the word of God may not be blasphemed. Certain women were just homekeepers, housewives. That's what they were. They enjoyed it, and so forth. Others not. Others are out going to work. It just depended on the circumstances. But they were to learn from their husbands. Paul pointed out that Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived. Eve was deceived. That's why Paul said, let the woman understand the theology from the husband. The husband in general. In general, there are always exceptions. There are always exceptions. But in general, the man is better able to understand those scriptures and those concepts than the woman. And so Paul wants the woman to learn that from the man at home. And that was the whole pattern of what we had. So we find that Paul was never against women. He never put women down at all in the slightest. But he wanted that pattern. He wanted that husband-wife relationship to be secure, that you had it properly. So the upshot of it all is that we should submit ourselves one to another. We should love one to another. The husband should submit to the wife by listening to her, and the wife submits to the husband by looking up to him. But what was the main purpose for which a wife was made? Back there in Genesis. To be a man's ezer kenegdo, a fighting spirit with him. I can remember years ago when I was just a student at Ambassador College, and Mr. Herbert Armstrong would actually say this. So I'm not saying anything that he didn't admit himself. He's talking about it. Times he'd be going off explaining this or saying that. And Loma, his wife, she was no shrinking violet. I'll tell you. No, not Loma Armstrong. Oh, she could be feisty. And sometimes she would get up and she would say, Herbert, now Herbert, gotta listen here. Oh, yes, you're right. I'm sorry. He'd back down because Loma Armstrong was acting as an ezer kenegdo. And that means you listen to your husband, you obey your husband, but when you realize he's going astray in a way that he doesn't have it fully right, that he's missing something, then it's up to the wife to talk to him. And so let us be thankful and let us pray and hope that every woman in the Church of God who is a wife will truly fulfill her role as an Ezer Kenegdo.